Hi Year 11s, welcome to the second video in the Circulatory System PowerPoint. We're looking at blood around the body this time. We do have our second guest appearance in 2 weeks. I don't know how long he'll be hanging around, but hopefully he won't be too much of an interruption. Alright, so first off, when we're talking about transport around the body or blood around the body, we need to talk about what the purpose of having blood around our body is, and that purely the purpose is the transport of materials. So if our cells weren't exchanging materials with our surroundings, we wouldn't be able to survive. Organisms wouldn't be able to survive. All of that is done through the tissue fluid surrounding the cells, so the extracellular fluid around the cells. Now, obviously, we can't have that fluid constantly giving nutrients to our cells and taking away the waste from our cells without somehow replacing the nutrients and removing the waste from it itself. So, that's what blood is for. So, humans have blood vessels and circulatory system, and those blood vessels take away, or mainly the capillaries, take away the waste from the extracellular fluid, and they give nutrients to replace the ones the extracellular fluid has lost. So capillaries basically are transporting materials to the extracellular fluid, which allows the extracellular fluid to exchange those materials with cells. So technically the 2 circulations. Now I'm not going to go too much through this slide on this page. We're going to talk about it more on the next page, which is the diagrams. Know that yes, there is technically 2 circulations because the heart is divided in 2. We've got deoxygenated blood, which is shown in blue on diagrams. It's not really blue in real life. Oxygenated blood in red. In each part of the heart, we've got an atrium and a ventricle. Atrium is the Latin word for entrance hall, so that's where blood enters the heart. Let's have a look. Let's not spend too long on this one. Let's have a look. So, doesn't want to move. There we go. So, over here, we've got 2 diagrams here. We've got a moving one here showing how the blood's moving around the body. And we have our static diagram over here, which is probably the one we'll talk about a little bit more. So, we're going to start our journey in the right ventricle, which is here. So where the mouse is right now. Just quickly, you'll notice that I'm calling that the right ventricle, which is the bottom of the heart here, right ventricle, when technically that's on the left side of the diagram. So you've got to assume, this is going back a slide, this is the anatomical pose. So in the anatomical pose, you've got a person standing there like that. Now, we refer to this side of the heart as the right, even though it's on the left, because it's that model's right-hand side. So it's the actual patient's right-hand side. So remember, in biological diagrams, everything's going to be flipped around to the opposite, left and right. So right ventricle is actually on the left in the diagram. So we start in the right ventricle and we go up through the pulmonary artery. Now you notice in this diagram the blood is blue, so that means we don't have oxygen. We're going from the pulmonary artery straight to the lungs, and anything with the word pulmonary means it's doing with the respiratory system. So we're going from the right ventricle right up until we get to the lungs. At the lungs, you'll have blood go through your capillaries. So it's left the arteries, gone through the capillaries. It's exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide with the alveoli sacs. And then it's carrying the oxygen, which is indicated by the fact that we've now got oxygenated blood in red, through the pulmonary vein, right back until we get to the left atrium. So we're entering the heart through the atrium on the left-hand side. Now, immediately that blood is pushed through into the left ventricle, and from the ventricle, it's pushed out of the aorta to the rest of the body. Now, obviously, it's going to split around through hepatic arteries, mesenteric arteries, renal arteries, and other organs through different arteries. It's going to exchange that oxygen with those organs, so liver, gut, kidneys, and other organs. And then it's going to come back deoxygenated with carbon dioxide back through the renal vein, hepatic portal vein, renal vein, etc., and mainly the vena cava, is where they all collect back into the vena cava and back into the right atrium, so entering back in the heart. So you'll notice over here that the right-hand side of the body is always dealing with deoxygenated blood. The left-hand side of the body here is always dealing with oxygenated blood. Blood always enters the heart through the atrium and always leaves the heart via the ventricle. You'll also notice that, like we've talked about in the last video, blood is always leaving the heart through an artery, or aorta, which is just a bigger version of an artery, and always enters the heart through a vein and the vena cava, which is again a big vein. You can see a more a less static version of this diagram without any annotations on the left here as well. So, blood capillaries, just a bit more on capillaries. So we know that blood's pumped from the heart into arteries, and it flows from those arteries into smaller vessels called arterioles. So we've got our artery here pumping into arterioles. Those arterioles will then lead into a dense network of vessels called capillaries, which is what we've got here. And now, with capillaries, their average diameter is about 10 micrometers. They're not visible to the naked eye. So until we discovered capillaries, we had microscopes that we could actually view capillaries with. Humans and researchers thought that once your blood left your arterioles and arteries, it kind of just diffused or percolated through the tissues into the veins. As we've talked about before, capillaries are only 1 cell thick. That means they're permeable to all the nutrients and gases that we have inside of our blood, or outside of the blood. It's also worth noting when we come from the arteries into the capillaries, like we talked about in the excretory system last week, the pressure increases in those capillaries. We're leading from a large, not that big, but a large tube into a smaller one. We're not changing how much liquid we're putting through, so obviously the pressure has to change, and that means the pressure is actually increasing. It is worth noting that the plasma molecules are too large to leave capillaries. That means the concentration of plasma in the capillaries increases as you move through the capillaries. That causes osmotic pressure to be larger than blood pressure, and that means there's movement of water molecules from the tissue back into capillaries, and that helps the waste materials be removed because it's coming back in through that water. The volume of fluid that returns from tissues is slightly less than the volume that enters the tissues. That doesn't mean that there's accumulating fluid in the tissues or in your tissues. That means that fluid is going elsewhere, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the lymphatic system. Now, so lymphatic system is all working with lymph capillaries. So basically your body tissue contains microscopic lymph capillaries in addition to your blood capillaries. So lymph capillaries have walls, again, 1 cell thick, but the difference between these capillaries and the capillaries we've talked about is that lymph capillaries are closed off at one end. That means they can only transport fluid away from the tissue. They can't bring anything to the tissue. All that fluid that's inside lymph capillaries is called lymph, and it's similar in composition to tissue fluid. In addition, it also contains white blood cells called lymphocytes, which we looked at in infectious diseases. Now, if we're talking about the villi of the small intestine, they have lacteals, which are small lymph capillaries, inside their villi, which drain fluid away from the exchange surface. That also helps because it transports many of the products of lipid digestion, removing them from the blood and the small intestine. Lymph capillaries eventually lead to lymph vessels, which will carry those lymph through nodes, and the lymph will be filtered as it moves. Eventually, it returns to the circulatory system via 2 large lymph vessels, and will drain back into the blood just above the heart.